Hello, I'm Cheyenne Meadows, and I'm the High Ability Learning Specialist at the Nebraska Department of Education. Today, I have with me Jude Sparrow from UNK. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Jude Macho-Sapero, and I'm the Director of Gifted Education at the University of Nebraska-Kearney.
And today, we're going to be talking about a study that we did when COVID kind of first hit, about the effectiveness of these webinar series to deliver professional education, especially in the realm of gifted education and high ability learning. So the first question is kind of, how did this webinar series come to be? And in the era of COVID-19, delivering professional learning was more difficult than ever. The lack of certainty surrounding substitutes, living in survival mode, these all created additional barriers to accessing learning opportunities for educators. And so we wanted to reach educators with information about high ability students. And that was difficult before a global pandemic, but adding that in made it an additional challenge. When COVID first hit, it became necessity to be familiar with online platforms. So we wanted to get a little bit creative for delivering professional learning. And because of COVID, there was a growing familiarity with Zoom and Teams and WebEx and all of those other different kinds of platforms. And so because we as educators and as a society had to transition to doing all of our things online, that made the use of online web-based experiences kind of ubiquitous. And so everybody understood how to use Zoom and, how to use Zoom or how do you mute and unmute and turning cameras off, and even getting into meetings became so ubiquitous that everybody is now able to do it. And that means people more open than ever for attending PLs online. And additionally, Nebraska is a really large state, and I started in the middle of the pandemic in June 2020. And while being in person is always a great experience, traveling around Nebraska and doing isolated professional learning takes a lot of time and doesn't reach nearly as many people. While I love going out and getting to see people, it does reach a lot more in this web-based format. And while COVID necessitated online learning, we also saw it as an opportunity to make PL more widely accessible to those across Nebraska. And so this brought up this idea of, is this the new way forward? Even though there were significant barriers, raising awareness about the social, emotional, and academic needs of gifted students was more important than ever, especially when the pandemic set in. And we know that a lot of our high ability learners maybe struggled in that transition. And that's when we decided on this synchronous, asynchronous webinar series. And so in the fall of 2020, we arranged the very first one, and into spring of 21. We arranged 6 one-hour webinars that were offered live, and they were also recorded. And so each series had a focus. So for those of you who are familiar, the fall was SEL focused, and then the spring was differentiation focused. And the webinars were promoted to all educators in Nebraska, as well as surrounding states, and participants were not just limited to gifted and talented teachers, but we also had administrators, general education teachers, and the state is so large, it's often difficult to deliver professional learning equally to all corners. And so this idea of this style of professional learning, is it sustainable and can it stick around past the pandemic? And that's when we came up with our research questions, because curiosity and the need to ensure that we're doing best practices led to this idea for collecting data, and thus our research questions. And even though this was necessitated by COVID, again, we wanted to see if this would be an efficient and effective way to continue delivering professional development learning in the future for educators. And so we looked at 3 main areas. We looked at, is the format, so is this webinar format an effective way to deliver PL? Are educators able to gain information from the webinars that they can use in their classrooms, which is what this is really all about? And did the synchronous and asynchronous delivery of the webinars have a significant benefit?
All right, so as Cheyenne mentioned, we worked together to develop this webinar to reach as many educators as possible, not exclusive to gifted education. And online was an attractive option for so many learners for quite some time, even before COVID. Some academics and educational outlets were offering virtual learning opportunities for many, many years. So we just kind of picked up on what was already out there and tried to adapt it to the needs of the folks in Nebraska. The pandemic brought this learning opportunity to the forefront out of necessity rather than convenience for the learner's preference. So even though learners may have preferred to do this online prior to the pandemic, it wasn't offered. But here, a whole new door was open for people. So while the learning curve might have been a little bit steep, world events accelerated the need and expectations to embrace this type of learning style. And more opportunities became available. And we jumped on that bandwagon and made those opportunities available in the realm of gifted education and really all of education for people inside and outside of the state. Now that so many have had this type of learning opportunity, the level of fear and trepidation has been lifted, and more learners are embracing webinar learning and opportunities as the norm for learning. Next slide. All right, the challenge was to ensure that the webinar-based learning professional development opportunities were accessible to learners, particularly those learners who did not have any background or previous experience with this type of learning opportunity. Because of the increased need and the level of participation that we found in web-based learning opportunities, learners now, as a result of this past experience, have more and more opportunities to inform webinar developers about the level of information provided, and was the information useful to them? Did it resonate with their needs? And will they continue attending webinars?
So when we set out to take on this research, again, we used a lot of you who are going to watch this probably participated, which is really cool to see all of this come together. And those of you who took the Google survey, some of you we interviewed, we did some really awesome things to come up with some really positive data. And so this first one you'll see here, that as 51% of people watch the recordings to 49% watching the sessions live. This shows us that while educators they may not be able to make the live time. As we know, there's no good time for everyone to host these webinars. And so they are willing to go back and watch recordings that are accessible. And so having the webinars archived allowed viewers to see topics they're interested in, but maybe they couldn't make it at that time. And people showed willingness to go back in and do that in their own time when they had a free moment. And so the asynchronous element really provided a lot of help and was really useful in spreading information to more educators. And it went beyond what could be any scope that came with just having a live option only, which, as we know, pre-pandemic, it was really popular to have live options only. And even now, some only do it live. And so having that archived recording is really powerful, is what we found. And even more so, we see a similar split here of 51-48. And so almost half the participants noted that they went back in and watched the recordings again, or they watched some part of it to review information. And so going back, having those recordings there and accessible to go in and manipulate what they need and find the information that they need and use it again and just review it also was a really helpful tool. And anecdotally, some are showing these recorded sessions at ESU trainings. I've received emails from staff who saw one at a development and had a question. PLCs have used these, other audiences who would benefit from the information. And so having them there as well, people can use the recordings to further training. So if one person sees it and thinks it would be good for their whole PLC, that's something really great to show. And I know that Dr. Saparo uses them in her undergraduate class as well to show them sessions that, information that they might need. And so this, again, just reinforces that idea of this asynchronous style is very successful. And finally, we have this nice little bar graph. And if those of you who took the survey, these questions look a little bit familiar. But the results were overwhelmingly positive. And in this bar graph are the questions and the average of the responses. And we found that the accessibility and the 1 hour length was efficacious, and it was around a 4.6 out of 5, which is really great. And most sessions were held from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 p.m. And again, we know there's no good time for everybody, but the model of holding the sessions immediately after school resulted in about a 4.3 out of 5. And so again, really positive averages there. And in interviews, we heard some really great qualitative information. Some interviewees cite the accessibility and flexibility as strengths of using this method of professional learning. And one person said, quote, last year it was necessary, but this year's pros are convenience, easier to access, and reach a larger audience because the state is so spread out, end quote. And that just sums it up so well and is really poignant, because the point of really doing this and bringing this all together is that we can reach people in a state that is so geographically large. And when asked how the method of professional learning delivery can benefit educators in the state, one interviewee mentioned that this brings gifted and talented education to the forefront because this series was done in conjunction between the Department of Education and University of Nebraska at Kearney. So it makes it really visible and kind of stands out as more of a priority. And we were just really excited about the data we collected and how it can impact future research opportunities in professional learning. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Jude to talk about the implications.
Okay. So because of learner input from our webinar series, professional developers, other webinar developers have an opportunity to define their presentation repertoires and create learning presentations that meet the stakeholders' needs. In our situation, it was specific to the gifted community. And this is a very unique opportunity to learn from each other and to even learn about each other, because people who never get to see each other or interact at any level now have the opportunity to make connections with each other through these webinar series. It allows practitioners to share information and to expand upon the information they've learned, and even come up with ideas to share with us about what we can add to the webinar series, how we can make the webinar series better, what new topics and ideas need to be discussed. So the data collected presents webinar developers with a unique insight that normally they wouldn't have access to. Many of us have been to professional development opportunities, to conferences, and we're asked to fill out a form, either online or in person, about what the experience was like. Well, the webinar series allowed that same opportunity, but also allowed a longer period for reflection, because the questions were open for a longer period of time. So someone could go back and reflect and see what the webinar was about, maybe something they forgot, and really provide information that is very helpful to continue to improve and develop the webinar series beyond where we had it. So the learner's voice becomes the driving component of what is presented and how it's presented and how we can improve. And teachers are always looking for that. Administrators are always looking for that. We always want to make ourselves more accessible. We want to make the materials and information that we're presenting more accessible and make it resonate with the learners so that they will take this information and make it their own and share it with their students and others.
While we can share this information with the gifted community as a whole, this has been really impactful, especially we know for sure in Nebraska. And the need for that flexibility of synchronous and asynchronous web-based opportunities is clear. And so we can meet more of those needs of educators. And when developing these series, for example, we surveyed stakeholders in the fall and listened, and that's how we came up with the spring webinar series of differentiation, because that's what people said that they wanted to hear. And so we are able to see and shape the webinars based on needs, and this study can guide how we move forward in advanced gifted education in the state of Nebraska. Finally, we are always collecting data and we always want more. And so this is a survey very similar to the one we've been given. It is kind of separated out from our current data, but we always want to know more feedback. That's what all this is about. And this will help us again further the webinars and make them better for those in Nebraska. And so this is just a link to that Google form if you would like to fill it out. And even if you're watching the recording, it's still really useful information, because the more data we have, the better it can be. So that is us, and these are our emails. And so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or just want to say something about the webinars, you can feel free to email us, and we will do our best to answer any and all questions, and hope you have enjoyed these series.